We just uncovered, and this is crazy, that the number of provincial bureaucrats and PEI earning more than $100,000 jumped from 192 in 2022-23 to 342 in 2024-25. So nearly an 80% increase in just 2 years. However, if we didn't file these requests, nobody would know.
So Canadians across the country are probably sitting down at their kitchen tables around this week, the first week back to work after the holidays, and coming up with their New Year's resolutions. How they're going to be better next year, what you're going to improve on, what you should stop doing in the years past. It's an important exercise for everybody to do, but not just for regular Canadians, but it also should be for some of the politicians across this country as well. And not just the politicians in Ottawa, though they have many resolutions they should make, but also across the country. I was just thinking about a resolution that we should see from the public safety minister in Ottawa because they just released the final details from their Cape Breton pilot project for the gun confiscation. The Ottawa set out to take 200 guns from people in that area. They ended up only taking 25. Clear failure. So New Year's resolution for the public safety minister should realize that this isn't something that's going to work. It's just going to waste taxpayers' money, not make Canadians safer. So we should finally throw in the towel on that useless program and save taxpayers' money. But of course, across the country, there's other politicians that need to do things a little bit better or a lot better in the new year. And one that I think is going to have a couple of examples for us is old Noah in Ontario. Can you tell us what some things that Doug Ford needs to do better next year or this year?
Yeah, so Premier Doug Ford clearly has a problem with spending. One of the things that he committed to when he was first coming into office back in 2018 was certain spending cuts in order to cut down on the amount of borrowing the Ontario government was doing back when Kathleen Wynne was the premier. But if we really add up what Premier Ford's record, we can show that he's actually been spending far more than the government has been bringing in. On a year by year basis, Premier Ford has been increasing spending by $12.9 billion annually, even though revenues have only been going up by $9.8 billion, which means that the government has perpetually been borrowing more and more billions to be able to keep up with all of their spending demands. And they're spending on a lot of things that can easily be cut. $11.9 billion in corporate welfare this year, the highest that Ontario has ever spent on corporate welfare, and it's much larger than any other province, including Quebec. We're also spending millions more on hikes for MPP pay, a 35% hike in MPP pay. And that number is looking like it's going to go up each year from now on, as
But
well
Noah,
as.
aren't
Mhm.
those members of provincial parliament, don't they deserve all that money because they're spending so much time giving out those billions of dollars in corporate welfare? I mean, don't they need to get paid that much?
Well, Gage, look, when you go into politics, you should be trying to serve the people, not trying to serve yourself and enrich yourself. If you really want to get rich, try and go into business and try and provide some products or services that Canadians actually want. But when MPPs are presiding over a province whose economic growth is stagnant or even declining, where wages aren't really keeping up with the rate of inflation, where people are dealing with the cost of living struggle here in this province, then giving MPPs a 35% pay hike is massively just ignorant to the struggles that Ontarians are going through. And it really shows that the provincial legislature, their priorities are set on benefiting themselves and not the Ontarian people. So this ever increasing sort of blatant cavalierness with taxpayer dollars has led the Ford government to increase our debt by $121 billion in just 7 years, rising all the way to $459 billion. dollars. That's about $28,000 in debt per Ontarian. So this debt plunge that Ontario Premier Doug Ford has been going on in the past 7 years has to end. He has to tighten up his belt, do like how many Ontarians have been doing in the past few years, and really stop spending on all these lavish programs that you think you want to spend on, but are really unnecessary. You shouldn't be spending $11.9 billion on corporate welfare, all that money on political welfare, and yet we are. So the number one thing that Premier Ford needs to do is tighten up his belt, cut spending, and get Ontarians back into a position where we're not spending billions upon billions of dollars every year on debt interest.
Yeah, so Premier Ford, I think Noah lays it out pretty well. Cut some of that wasteful spending. Stop spending so much money on those debt interest payments. No, it's so funny when you always mention how big Ontario's debt is, right? 459 billion, if I heard you right. That's the budget of like several Saskatchewans, not just the
Yeah,
debt,
if you
the
think if you
total
tally up
budget.
all the maritime budgets, it might not get up to 459
Yeah, I
billion.
don't think it'll get close, actually. And speaking of maritime budgets and Atlantic Canada, if I'm using the right words, we've brought on Devin Drover, our Atlantic Director and General Counsel, this week onto Out of Ottawa, because we're missing a couple of the familiar faces, to chat to us about some New Year's resolutions that some of those other Eastern premiers should be making to better serve their taxpayers. Devin, you got some rules for us?
So yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on out here in Atlantic Canada that calls for New Year's resolutions, and I would love to see all four of the premiers out here sit to the table and work on their own lists. But let's talk about a couple of them. I'm not gonna belabor the point and go through all four provinces because we all know it's a mess out here in Atlantic Canada. But let's talk about a couple of them. First, to kind of echo Noah's resolution, here in Newfoundland and Labrador, we also desperately need to get spending under control. Newfoundland and Labrador just had their fiscal update last month. The deficit, the amount that they're borrowing this year, is 155% higher than what they expected just in the spring of last year. So they predicted to borrow just a couple $100 million. They end up borrowing $847 million. So essentially, unless a different path is charted here in Newfoundland and Labrador, we are going to be borrowing indefinitely. In fact, the increase in the deficit last year, the 576 million increase in the deficit is greater than the 528 million they planned as surpluses over the next 3 years. So the increase in deficit alone was greater than the surplus or the predicted surplus over the next 3 years.
Yeah,
Net
so
debt is now expected to reach 19.5 billion at the end of the present fiscal year. This means the government or the Newfoundland and Labrador taxpayers will be spending $1.1 billion every year just to service provincial debt. And again, when we're looking at a small province, $1.1 billion may not seem like a lot when you're considering the population of Ontario. Let's break that down per person. This works out to about $2,100 for every Newfoundlander and Labradorian just going towards servicing interest on big government debt. That's money that is not being used to pay for essential services. That's money that cannot be used to return to Newfoundlanders and Labradorians in the form of tax relief. And what makes this all worse is, some provinces, they're always, politicians are always like, we don't know what to cut. We don't know what the answers are. The Newfoundland and Labrador government has the answers, folks. Just a few years ago, the then Premier Dwight Ball put together a panel of independent experts, the fancy name Premier's Economic Recovery Team, or PERT. And they were tasked with putting together a report that outlined how government can start living within its means. And, that they put it plainly. I'm going to quote the report. Newfoundland and Labrador's annual cash shortfall represents approximately 25% of its revenue. So about a quarter of the money that the
jeez.
government is spending is is not what they're taking in. There's a massive shortfall here. So the PERT report identified a bunch of ways that they can get spending under control in Newfoundland and Labrador. And in fact, if you look at just the savings that they identified for this present fiscal year that we're going into, the 2026-2027 fiscal year, they've identified $894 million in savings. That's more than the present deficit is more than we're borrowing year after year. Yet alone, you take the recommendations from previous years that they didn't implement. We have the answer, folks. They have a report sitting on the shelf up in Confederation Building that the new Premier Tony Wakeham, can start enacting this year. And that is the resolution for Newfoundland and Labrador. Let's stop sitting on our asses and actually start implementing the recommendations from this report that can save Newfoundlanders and Labradorians hundreds of millions of dollars, and then we can start putting more money back in the pockets of hardworking Newfoundlanders and Labradorians instead of big bond fund holders, whether it's on Bay Street or internationally.
Yeah, Devin, no, I think that's a great point. It's ridiculous. Oftentimes when we talk to politicians and we get journalists out there like, what to cut? And you've got to look, right? It's not budgets or dense, thick documents, but Newfoundland's done the work, but they're not following through. But not to put you on the spot here, but this thing has always kind of puzzled me about Newfoundland, right? People often say that Alberta and Saskatchewan do a little bit better, but not great fiscally than other provinces because they've got a bunch of natural resources that help cushion the blow for a lot of this stuff. But I've always been under the impression that Newfoundland also has a bunch of those natural resources. So who's messing it up so bad that that's not helping out? Like, what's happening there?
So, I mean, there's a few reasons. I mean, Newfoundland and Labrador, we got to go back all the way back to Premier Daniel Williams, because that's really when the resource money started coming in. And, Premier Williams, or then Premier Williams at the time, when he took office, he took the fiscal situation of the province seriously. He was willing to stand up to public sector unions asking for more money. He took a real stiff position to get the finances under the province or finances of the province under control. Then the resource money came in and the premier spent, spent, spent. So instead of, doing the proper thing, like starting a heritage fund to put money away for the future, he spent it all. We blew all of the money in the 2000s. And then when the fiscal crises happened, we basically was up the creek without a paddle. So
Mm.
it was a very bad situation here. And we're continuing to see that. Every time that there's resource revenue come in, we blow it away. And then the other thing that we do here is, we project politicians love to play with the books. They love to cook the books. When it comes to the price of oil, for example, they budget for that price of oil to be way above what everybody
Yep.
knows it's going to be. And that means every year when at the end of the year, when the actual price of oil is calculated, they back calculate it. They, of course, spend way more than they were going to take it in oil revenue. So again, we see Newfoundlanders and Labradorians essentially be consistently screwed by governments here, regardless of stripe, by playing with the books, by not just making hard decisions like implementing spending restrictions, like getting the costs of the civil service under control so they're not getting massively overpaid compared to their colleagues in the private sector. There's a lot that we need to do, and it can't be just creating more revenue sources. That's what government says when they want to find new ways to tax
More
us.
taxes. Yeah.
Exactly. We need to get spending under control here in Newfoundland and Labrador, and that needs to be a resolution for the new Premier Tony Wakeham. He was elected with a mandate to cut taxes. We're going to hold him to that this year. But he also needs to, on the other side, get spending under control. Every dollar that's borrowed just means either higher taxes in the future or service cuts. The premier needs to get spending under control here in Newfoundland and Labrador, and we're going to hold him to that this year.
If I could put
No.
a point on something you said, Devin, I mean, you said that a lot of these spending problems you guys have had started when you guys started receiving an influx of revenue from your natural resources. And I can't help but think that, when premiers or politicians in general receive these massive influx in revenue, it's kind of a double-edged sword because in some sense it's a good thing that the people of that province are able to receive maybe more services or higher quality services, but at the end of the day, it sort of gives the politicians a false impression that this sort of major cash influx is going to last forever, that we're going to perpetually continue to win the lottery. Premier Ford saw this because revenues were going up 9% annually, which is pretty good, if your revenues are going up that much on an annual basis. But that effect is immediately offset by the rapid spending that he's doing, a 12% increase annually in spending. So when politicians see that their government is going to be taking in a lot more money than they had in years previous, taxpayers need to ensure that these politicians are not just blowing all this money on a bunch of waste, but that they are instead reinvesting that money into heritage funds, or at the very least, not further putting the province in a place where when those revenues start to slow down, that you're going to have to borrow billions upon billions in order to keep up with all of your spending commitments.
Well, you don't give someone with a shopping addiction another credit card to solve that problem. And I think that's where it goes to at the end, right? Is the government always has a spending problem. Giving them a little bit more money to get them to the end of the month is not going to solve it. And that's why I think both of your resolutions are so important for the premiers, right? Ontario, cut that spending. Same thing in Newfoundland and Labrador. But Devin, I think you also had a slightly different one talking about Prince Edward Island, a province that often I don't think gets a lot of shout outs on this podcast. So if you got some information there, it'd be good to show.
Yeah, so I mean, and it doesn't surprise me. A lot of people don't think about the tiny little province of PEI, a great province nonetheless with great people. Unfortunately, those people are one of only two provinces that have a lack of transparency with how
Mhm.
government is spending their money. And by that, I mean PEI does not have a sunshine law. So, for those who are unfamiliar with these, sunshine lists or sunshine laws essentially reveal who is getting the top salaries from the provincial government. Which bureaucrats are cashing in or getting big six-figure salaries in most provinces. Every other province besides PEI and Quebec has one of these. Ontario introduced one, I think, in the 90s. We've seen this across the country. We have these laws in place that shows, who's getting big taxpayer-funded salaries and what are they getting it for? What are their job titles? Who are they working for within the provincial government? PEI doesn't have this. Mind you, here at the CTF, we're always using access information laws to kind of pry open the government books. And through
Hmm.
this, we just uncovered, and this is crazy, that the number of provincial bureaucrats in PEI earning more than $100,000 jumped from 192 in 2022-23 to 342 in 2024-25. So nearly an 80% increase in just 2 years. However, if we didn't file these requests, nobody would know. And what makes it worse is, yes, we have the information on the numbers, but we don't have information on the names. We don't have full information on what's going on here. So that's an important New Year's resolution for PEI is to bring in a sunshine list. And courts. I serve I have two hats here at the CTF. I serve as their Atlantic director, but I'm also a general counsel. I'm an in-house lawyer where, I'm taking matters to court on behalf of taxpayers. Newfoundland and Labrador has had a court challenge on this. Unions challenged the disclosure of names here in Newfoundland and Labrador of high earning bureaucrats. And it went all the way to the top court here in Newfoundland and Labrador, the Court of Appeal, where the ruling was unequivocal in upholding taxpayers' rights. And I'm going to read from that decision. The public has a legitimate and significant interest in the identities of the people who receive public money. Disclosing names promotes meaningful participation in the democratic process and accountability. And the court absolutely had it right here, right? The provinces or taxpayers have a right to see how their money is being spent. And it provided a roadmap in that decision for the entire country. And the results when they brought in a sunshine list here in Newfoundland and Labrador spoke for itself. They introduced the sunshine list, and people immediately noticed that executives at Nalcor, which was a Crown corporation, a Crown Energy corporation at the time, were earning up to 270,000 more than comparable government officials. So this
Hmm.
caused a lot of controversy, and eventually led to an independent audit. And what they found out was that Nalcor was spending on crazy things the taxpayers would never approve of. They were spending 250K a year on alcohol, cigars, parties, golf fees. There were even cash gifts for staff. And all of it was being billed to taxpayers year after year. So by bringing in a sunshine list, it caused people to know that their tax dollars were being spent on high salaries. It caused an independent audit. And then it found all of this waste. And after public outrage, the government eventually shut down Nalcor to begin with. They folded into Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro under tighter financial controls. And that is the power of transparency. So, When politicians and bureaucrats know that taxpayers are watching, they think twice before rubber stamping pay hikes or, giving, billing perks to the public. When names are published alongside paychecks, accountability follows. And that is why PEI this year needs to bring in a sunshine law.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And in Manitoba, we have a good sunshine list there. I've been working on that, and I found that the number of bureaucrats earning more than $100,000 has doubled in the past couple of years. So it just goes to show how important these transparency rules are. And it's absolutely ridiculous that PEI is one of the only two provinces who don't have one. I mean, and not to throw shade on PEI, it seems like it would take a bureaucrat about an afternoon to do that because, how many people work for the government of PEI in total? Not as many as some of those other massive provinces where they could say that could be some sort of issue. But
Well,
if you
well,
guys,
they know who it is because they put together the
right?
record for
Yeah,
me
that's true. They told you, yeah.
of the what was it I said 342 people. They know who it is. All they need to do is take their names and put them and publicly release them. It could be done in 30 minutes, Gage. You could have this online in a heartbeat. I'm sure there's a bureaucrat in there that can take 30 minutes of their busy afternoon on a Monday or a Friday to release the records and give Islanders the transparency they deserve. And this year is going to be a big year in PEI politics. There's a PC leadership race. The PCs are the governing party of Prince Edward Island right now. There is a leadership race in which the winner of that race will become the next premier. So we'll be holding these PEI PC leadership candidates to account to make them commit to a sunshine list. So stay tuned, folks. I know we may not have a huge PEI following on this particular podcast, but I will provide updates. We will get a sunshine list in PEI and give Islanders the transparency that they deserve.
That's awesome and sounds like a lot of fun. If we win that fight, I'm sure Quebec is only shortly behind. But if you guys will allow me, I'd like to yabber on about Saskatchewan and Manitoba for a couple of minutes. So first off, New Year's resolution for Premier Wab Canoe out in Manitoba. Stop hiking taxes is pretty much the easiest one. Better yet, if you get that far, start cutting taxes. So last year we saw that the Manitoba government ended its gas tax cut, but then it brought in an income tax hike through bracket creep, which is a sneaky way of hiking taxes through inflation. And it's especially sneaky because politicians don't even vote on it, right? And that tax hike is costing Manitobans about $82 million a year. So the first step to start the new year off right in the next budget for Premier Wab Canoe should simply be to stop that tax hike, go back to indexing tax brackets, keep saving taxpayers money that way, stop hiking them, stop hiking their taxes through a stealthy hidden tax hike like bracket creep. That's what taxpayers are asking for. Then we go to Saskatchewan, where Premier Scott Moe, to his credit, has been doing a couple good things for taxpayers recently. There's been a few tax cuts overall in the province over the last couple of years. There has been too much spending, but that's how it goes often with provincial governments. But the New Year's resolution for Scott Moe, for Saskatchewanians, is to stand strong against the industrial carbon tax. So, as a Saskatchewanian, we can claim to be the only carbon tax-free province in the country. So, take that, you guys. But we've seen recently that Alberta has done an agreement with the federal government to increase its industrial carbon tax. And it's very likely that the feds are also asking similar things of the government of Saskatchewan, despite having it canceled for almost a full year. So what the New Year's resolution for taxpayers is to Premier Scott Moe is to not take any of the goodies that Prime Minister Mark Carney might dangle in front of you and instead keep the industrial carbon tax gone in Saskatchewan, stand strong on that fight. It's been good. And also, some of our recent polls shows that about 70% of Saskatchewanians support that. So that's not just a partisan issue. That's broad support across everyone. So keep it going for the people of Saskatchewan. Make their lives more affordable without that carbon tax. And don't agree to whatever backroom deal Mark Carney might be offering you at this time.
Gage,
Well,
I just want to jump in very quick here,
Hmm.
and yeah, let's throw shade on all provinces in Canada for, putting up with an industrial carbon tax, except for Saskatchewan. But let's be real clear here, and our colleague Chris Sims isn't here, so I'll do this for her. we need to put serious shame on the government of Alberta for breaking their promise and bringing an industrial carbon tax. Pathetic. That is my message to Premier Daniel Smith. Pathetic. You dangled, you took the goodies from Mark Carney. Whether or not it actually happens on a pipeline or anything else is up in the air, and we can debate that for days. But it is absolutely pathetic for Alberta to bow down to the king and accept a federal carbon tax. It is shameful. It is pathetic. And we need to make sure that this country is an industrial carbon tax free place. And good on Scott Moe for leading this fight. And it's so important that he keeps that up this year.
And it's especially puzzling that Premier Smith would commit to increasing her province's carbon tax for a deal in which the province might possibly potentially be able to build a pipeline sometime down the future over to the BC coast. Because, well, if that pipeline eventually does get built, then that oil that is being produced and being shipped out to global markets is going to be less productive because that oil is being generated in a carbon tax province, meaning that the cost of production is going to go up, and that makes Canadian oil a lot less competitive. And we're seeing some concern from say the opposition leader in Canada, Pierre Poilievre, and some other premiers over the fact that Venezuelan oil might be coming online soon, and they have a similar type of oil to us, heavy crude oil, which means that if Canadian oil is more expensive than its competitors, other countries are much more willing to just buy the cheaper Venezuelan oil than they are to buy the Canadian oil because, yes, we Canadians are dealing with a cost of living crisis here in this country, but there are many countries that, are just developing. There are third world countries that are trying to put themselves into the first world, and they need cheap energy to be able to have their societies progress. So I just think that Premier Smith committing to increasing the carbon tax in our province, despite being in the forefront of the fight against federal carbon taxes, it is, as Devin said, pretty shameful. And I hope that Premier Smith does everything in her power to step back from that commitment, try her best to get a pipeline built without increasing carbon taxes in her province.
Well, there you have it, folks. We've got some New Year's resolutions for some different provinces and the feds all across the country, plus a little bit of geopolitics tossed in there at the end. But if you liked any of those resolutions, we definitely have petitions on taxpayer.com about all of them. So head on over to our website. That's taxpayer.com again. Sign one of those petitions to get involved in those fights. And as always, we want to ask you if you like this video to like, share, and subscribe, and send to a couple friends who need to know.